Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Welcome to In This Economy. My name is Mike Eppel. Thanks for joining us to talk about everything that is economically related to what's been going on in the summertime and how Canada's dealing with the Trump tariffs and what some of the most recent economic statistics have pointed to for policy at the Bank of Canada, what it could mean for government policy later this fall. And to talk about the most recent stats that have been in this week, the jobs data in particular, Don Drummond, noted economist, Stafford Dunning Fellow at Queen's University and Fellow in Residence at the C.D. Howe Institute, joins me on the line. Hello there, Don. Nice to see you. Haven't talked to you in a while. How's your summer been going?
Very well, full of lots of pickleball. Just finished playing for the day.
Does that take your mind off the all of the daily machinations of what Trump may be proclaiming and how that affects the big picture from the economy?
I swore to myself on this second term I wasn't going to do what I did in the first term and follow everything he says and does. It's hard to ignore.
There's a scene from the old movie Airplane where the plane is in trouble and the flight controller says, "I've picked a bad time to give up smoking." I kind of feel like that this summer, just watching social media.
Makes me think, surely you can't be serious.
I am serious, and don't call me Shirley. Very good. Very good. This week, where we had the jobs data for July, was kind of a case in point of how we've been trying to figure out exactly how the Trump tariffs are impacting Canada's economy, because originally back in April when Liberation Day was taking place and all of the initial threats were being made, and even in fact before that, go back to February, we thought that the economy would really fall off a cliff. And at the end of the day, it really hasn't done that. Yes, there's been all sorts of uncertainty. The labor market this week showed 41,000 jobs lost last month, but that was, preceded by 83,000 gained in June. So that's been kind of choppy. The unemployment rate's elevated. Is that the situation where do you think the biggest fears or risks have yet to materialize or aren't going to materialize when it comes to the economic damage?
Well, let's first start with the two outliers to the positive side. We had that kind of surprising 2.2% gain in real GDP in the first quarter. Now that the dust has settled on that, it's pretty clear that that resulted from a pulling forward of exports. Companies just tried to whip in under the window to get their exports out of Canada before the tariffs started to come into play. And if you look at the Bank of Canada monetary policy report that came out recently, they estimate that the economy contracted 1.5% in the second quarter. So if you look at the first half, poof, that little burst of growth is gone. And the employment's a similar situation. People get tired of hearing people like me saying, it's a pretty good survey, but it is a small survey. You can't put a lot of stock in 1 month. So we had that 80,000 job gain in June, and everybody's scratching their head and thinking that's pretty phenomenal. Maybe things aren't as bad. And of course, as you just said, we lost half of that, more than half of that with the July. Probably a more sensible picture on both real GDP and employment is the look since the beginning of the year. And we're flat. We're flat in real GDP and we're flat on employment. And again, if I go back to the Bank of Canada annual review, that's basically what they said. They clearly are looking through that burst of growth in the first quarter, and clearly they looked through that burst in employment in June. Obviously, they didn't know it was going to decline as early as July, but yeah, the economy hasn't fallen off a cliff, but it is flat, and that's not good. I'm to some degree really influenced and anecdotal. I won't reveal who said what because it's confidential, but we did have our 8th meeting of the C.D. Howe Trade Crisis Group, and we have the CEOs of not only many of the large corporations, but many of the corporations most affected. And uncertainty paralysis would be the impression you come away with. And some of the quick things that we say prove to be way more difficult. For example, you can't export your steel to the United States, so just displace the steel imports coming into Canada. Well, it turns out they don't manufacture the steel products that are needed in Canada. They don't actually make structural beams. They shape their entire industry to fill the supply chain in the United States. They would need, if not new plants, complete retrofits of plants to change that around. You look at the Japanese car makers in Canada, even if they wanted to appease Trump and add additional production in the United States, they have no excess capacity in their production in the United States. Needless to say, they are not increasing their investments in Canada whatsoever, not doing anything. They really don't know to go. And of course, we say, well, if you can't export your agricultural products to the United States, export them somewhere else. And then you look into the details, a large part of our exports are fresh fruits and vegetable live animals. Pretty tough to export that very far. So this is very difficult and not going to come out at any time soon. Now, a lot of comfort is being taken, for example, the 35% tariff Trump recently announced is protected for goods that are under the Canada, US, Mexico trade agreement. So it's estimated 91% of Canadian exports are still going to the United States without a tariff, but still the average effective tariff rate on Canadian exports is 6.4%. You add in their tariff-like penalties on softwood lumber, and then add in the breakdown of the most favored nation process, and the effective cost that's added to Canadian exports is about 10%. Now we're talking real money. You see this danger of the normalization of the abnormal, and when the United Kingdom strikes a deal at 10%, there's sort of a sigh of relief. Well, it's only 10%. Well, wait a minute. 10% is matches, if not exceeds, the profit margin of most exports. That shuts down most exports. That's an horrific outcome. So I think things are a lot worse than people are taking, certainly a lot worse than the stock market is interpreting. And I was quite intrigued by the comments of the governor in the press conference when he talked about permanent scarring, because that's what I'm worried about. All our models we use, the Department of Finance, the banks, Bank of Canada, et cetera, they can only estimate things that happened over the historical period over which the models are estimated. The average effective tariff rate of imports in the United States right now is 18%. We haven't seen that since the 1930s. It's not in their models. You have to go back to the 1890s and 1930s. These models do not inform you what happens. Even the 10% in Canada, that's not in our models. We don't know what that would do in a longer term effect, and it's not nice. And maybe someday we'll diversify our exports. Maybe someday we'll diversify our product mix, but that's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. And then, of course, we're faced with this weak productivity, which gives us a very weak base from which to completely transform our economy. How's that for depressing?
Well, you talk what is and what isn't being tariffed at that, the big headline about the 35% tariff rate on Canadian exports, but then you talk about, what's under the free trade agreement. How is it that steel and aluminum are not included in free trade, or for that matter?
Well, they are. So
they just call those out.
It's illegal, and that's why it means absolutely nothing of it a trade agreement. So what does it mean that the European Union established a trade agreement? That it was accepted by the president, who has no authority to accept it. It included $600 billion of promised investment in the United States, which would have to come from individual member countries in the European Union and from companies. The head of the European Union has absolutely no authority to bind countries to do that, and has no influence on companies whatsoever. Congress has not approved that agreement. It means absolutely nothing. None of the trade agreements mean absolutely anything. Trump and the U.S. administration, with their benign support, are trampling over legal agreements, and it's in the courts, and they may well ultimately find it is, but you can be pretty sure that if the rap of the knuckles is Congress needs to improve this, that Congress will just approve it. So that's not necessarily going to put an end to this. And we have to remember, we might take comfort that 91% of our exports are still going tariff-free, but that Canada, US, Mexico agreement is up for review next year. And of course, with 6 months notice, the US, anybody else can walk away from it. And they're already violating it. They're already illegally violating the conditions of it. So it really means nothing.
Okay. Now you raise a few points there that I wanted to talk about, specifically the point that, Trump is announcing, we got to get the phraseology right here. He's announcing, quote, deals with the EU and with the UK and with Japan, which aren't really deals. They're, nothing has been signed. Ursula von der Leyen was saying, after she met, big press conference photo op with Trump, he said, it's still up for negotiation. And I guess, to go back to something, a catchphrase from earlier in the year, maybe it was late last year, concepts of a plan. These things aren't.
Yeah, yeah.
These things aren't real in the big scheme of things, and it seems like all they're doing is making, well, for lack of a better description, Trump look good, that he's got something that he can announce and say it's a deal.
Yeah, well, this could be completely meaningless, and you're seeing quite a backlash in Britain and throughout the European Union on what their heads of states accepted. And there's a whole process after that. I mean, we remember with the renewal of the free trade agreement, there was a long process to get approval on both sides. And it wasn't certain until the very end that that was actually going to happen. And then, of course, it turns out it didn't really matter because the U.S. is violating it at any rate.
Oh,
You know, one thing that's really quite amusing, if you look at these trade letters that have been being sent out by the White House, it's not even that they haven't gone through Congress. You have to be quite suspicious that they've not been handled by anybody other than Trump personally and an intern who's taken the dictation. It is pretty shocking in 2025, in one of the most highly educated countries, these letters sent out by their head of state are full of spelling errors, grammatical errors, and syntax errors. How does that happen? I think nobody even in the trade office has seen these letters that are going out. I mean, wouldn't they correct spelling errors?
That indicates that they're afraid to even challenge any of the mistruths and or announcements that Trump may have. I mean, case in point, this past week he was saying that Japan was going to, or maybe it was the EU, I can't even remember which one it was. I think Japan was at 500 billion and the EU was at 600 billion.
Yeah, for the investments that they promised.
And for anything that Trump wanted that money for. And that's not at all how it works. But no one was willing to challenge him in the interview I saw that on, that it's like that's, you know, for Congress to appropriate. And then the reality is Japan's pledge to invest in the United States half a trillion dollars, $1 billion of that was direct investment. The rest was just loans for Japanese companies to do something if they wanted. It's fictitious.
Well, look at the ultimate lie. He's still saying that the foreign countries are paying the tariffs. Right. And there has been some eating of it, but all the estimates center around 80 to 85% of the tariffs so far have been paid by Americans. So effectively, he has put on a consumption tax. It's the only major country that doesn't have a national sales tax, and now effectively it does have one, which applies to imports. He won't admit that.
Well, that raises the next question about, are we actually going to see effects of these tariffs in the U.S. data after Trump fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because he proclaimed that the monthly jobs report, which was revised, was fake and phony. And then he talked about how they were revised before last fall's election, incorrectly saying that they were revised higher and then chopped afterwards. If in fact you can't trust the data, then what are we working with here? Like that's going to be I think the biggest challenge, to figure out exactly how, for central banks, if you can't trust the data, then what do you got?
Other countries have tried that. You remember Greece for a long time lied about their budget deficit numbers and their borrowing numbers, and they came across a bureaucrat with the audacity who wanted to print the true numbers, and they tried to fire him, and it got all involved in the courts. Argentina for decades lied about their inflation numbers, and that in both cases it ended up with an all-out financial crisis. So the stories didn't end very well of countries that have tried that. But now we've got Trump has now put on one of his internal advisors to fill a short-term vacancy on the Federal Reserve Board.
Yeah, it depends.
So that's coming very close. That he will appoint unambiguously next year somebody closely aligned to him. And of course, there's another thing that he fails to understand is the Federal Reserve Board has very little control over the longer term interest rates, which is really kind of surprising because even more so than the Canadian public debt, the US debt is long term and the Federal Reserve Board cannot directly affect that. In fact, if the Federal Reserve Board today tried to push down their policy rate, long-term rates would probably go up. But how do you explain that to somebody like that? He doesn't seem to understand that whatsoever.
Well, the pushback against the firing of the Bureau of Labor head was the fact that the data actually supported Trump's demand to cut interest rates in as much as it showed
Yeah, that's right.
a weakening
Well,
employment situation, and the U.S. Fed's got that dual mandate for not just inflation but also employment growth. So,
we have that disease in Canada. I mean, I've been doing a lot of interviews, and especially around the Bank of Canada announcement, and I've been trying to set up rah 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 rah. The Bank of Canada might cut interest rates, and I said, well, be careful what you ask for. They will cut interest rates if and when the economy weakens. Be careful what you ask for. It's not just like an exogenous movement that they cut interest rates. They'll cut interest rates because the economy is weak and needs lower interest rates. So if you've got a job and you keep your job and you've got a mortgage, that's good, but it's not good for anybody else. It's part and parcel of a weak economic environment.
thoughts on how the Feds are handling the trade negotiations such that they are. We have seen these deals, again, in quotation marks, with so many other countries. Trump this week, hit 90 countries with fresh reciprocal tariffs, which weren't really reciprocal. But nevertheless, the Carney government seems to be, kind of taking a, wait and see. They're not rushing to do any type of announcement, even though that has kind of proven, if you give the U.S. president a trophy, as the CEO of Apple did this past week, then maybe you can avoid tariffs.
Well, Canada has an ace that most of the other countries don't have, and that we do have the North American Trade Agreement. And so we can see things like the 35%, and for the moment think that's not going to affect us very much. And that wouldn't be the case with these other countries. But of course, it's not going to save us for very long because the review of that agreement comes up next year. I would strongly recommend the federal government to not do what these other countries are doing and sign an agreement now that accepts a pretty stiff tariff. And I think 10 or 15% is a very stiff tariff. And in return, I get absolutely nothing from the United States. I don't think we should rush into a kind of agreement like that. That doesn't make it any easier. I think we're going to have a very tough road. When you're negotiating with somebody, you usually have a pretty clear idea what the other side wants, and that's not the case. And you usually can take some comfort that the other side is not going to do something that's against their own interests, and that clearly is not the case either. So they're in a very, very tough position. And I really find it hard to come out swinging and criticize them given that difficult circumstance.
Well, it's going to be interesting when Parliament resumes, comes back later or next month. I would assume that they're going to resume sitting and talk about how all this is playing out from a budgetary standpoint, because that is something we have not yet seen from the Carney government. They've been spending a lot of money, offering support just this past week for the lumber industry and others that have been directly affected by the trade disruption. You have talked about forecasting that the Feds are looking at some pretty big internal budget cuts to save on government spending, or maybe redirect, to defense. Is this? Are you watching the daily events and just seeing the budget deficits accumulate? And when they come back, what we're going to be talking about this fall is going to be a pretty rough scenario for government budgeting, for lack of a better description.
In sympathy for the very difficult situation the Carney government finds themselves, I'm reluctant to criticize things like the trade, because you can always try to put yourself in that position and realize you're probably not going to do any better because it's so difficult. But the one thing I'm not hesitant to criticize is the lack of transparency in what's going on with the nation's finances. It is the money of the people of Canada. And to just keep doing all this new spending and not tell people how it's being financed. I mean, we went in a blink of an eye, we advanced the 2% of GDP defense. And then a few days after that, we miraculously went up to 5% with not a word. And the prime minister saying we're not going to pay for our taxes. And I said, well, then tell us how we are going to pay for it. It is the taxpayers' money, and they're not done that. I think the excuses for not doing a budget before the House rose are completely bogus. There's no reason why the House has to rise towards the end of June. They typically do. They didn't sit very many days in 2024 and the beginning of 2025. They certainly could have gone in the summer. If you or I facing a crisis, we'd probably be inclined to cancel our summer vacation. And, it takes too long to produce a budget. Well, it takes a long time to produce an 800-page document, which somehow can't produce the fiscal numbers until an annex on page 711. Nobody wants that. You can produce a 20-page update very quickly, and they should do that. And in fact, when they come back, I actually wouldn't go right into a budget. I would do a fiscal update. I think a budget itself is going to be so shocking. I would want a condition by, boy, the budget deficit's got up pretty high, and this is our plan. And of course, they have reaction. They reacted. They had a very unambitious internal program review, and of course, without coming clean to the public, what the new targets are. Clearly, they've steepened the kind of savings they're looking for. But people don't like surprises, and I think the government is going to pay a price for doing stuff with the lack of transparency. And if you explain the problem to people, they will understand it and they will support you. But if you just keep coming out and just do it under the table, don't tell them, and then come out with an unpleasant surprise, they will react and you won't like the reaction.
Well, there's already been, you're talking about telegraphing or laying the groundwork for change. The C.D. Howe Institute had that report on how much, the government departments are going to get hit, and there's going to be some sort of a restructuring effort and likely job losses, and immediately raised the ire of, the fact, oh my goodness, change? What? How can we have change at the government levels? But I mean, that's just really the tip of the iceberg from a spending standpoint.
Yeah, but the change occurred under the Trudeau administration, starting right back from 2015. The spending exploded during the pandemic, and they were very slow to bring it back. The size of the civil service increased almost 1/3 under the years of Trudeau. We as citizens can legitimately ask the question, what did we get for it? Their excuse is we started a whole bunch of programs like the child care and the dental care. The federal government's not running those programs. Those aren't involving a lot of civil servants. Those are run by the provinces and the private sector. The federal government's basically writing checks. So it doesn't take a lot of people to sign off on a check. So I don't really accept that. And then things that you and I are affected by, actually trying to get your T5 onto your My Account on the CRA, which was a total disaster, or kind of get somebody, the CRA or Social Security, to answer your phone call, and that doesn't happen. They got somewhat back on track of the passports, but that was impossible for a while. But the things that we see and touch and interact with the federal government, corresponding with this massive explosion in the civil service, we saw a deterioration in the services. So I'd kind of like to do a task force and figure, what are all these people doing?
Well, there was, the commentary that maybe we've got, and Carney, Prime Minister Carney, has shrunk the size of the cabinet, certainly from where it was during the Trudeau years. But there's still the theme of budgets over the previous decade was about very targeted, very niche spending on every specific category you could think of. And I have a feeling that any budgetary measure will be much more streamlined. I don't think we're going to be at these budgets that are 400 or 500 pages anymore. I mean, maybe back to
try 700.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
And the key fiscal statement doesn't even appear on annex. Like, that's the most astonishing thing about it. Like, why wouldn't the fiscal statement be right up front in a budget? They'll give you a summary, but none of the details until you get like page 711. And it's impossible for people like you and I, who even follow this stuff, to distinguish what is new spending and what's just a repeat of what's already in the budget, because they just add everything together. It's a disgrace the way the budgets have been done in recent years. I'll reveal my age. The first budget I worked on was back in 1977. They were remarkably short documents, and they basically said, here's the economic assumptions, here's the fiscal outcomes, and here are the actions. Thank you very much, and sit down.
Yeah.
And what was wrong with that?
There have always been about themes, I think, from that's kind of been the...
Well, they become communication devices, and they summarize everything the government has done in recent years, and they just get so long. But then you read about an initiative, and it's sort of presented like it's new, and you say, didn't I read about this in last year's budget? And then you look at it, sure enough, they were basically just repeating something it was already in last year's budget and already long included in the fiscal numbers.
Well, listen, we won't have to worry about that until for another month, so you don't have to read
Well,
this.
and if I said if I were them, I wouldn't come swinging out immediately with a budget. I would do a very early fiscal update, show people how bad it is, throw out some ideas as trial balloons, and not have a vote of confidence over your ideas, which is what you get with a budget, and then allow a period of consultation, consideration on the part of Canadians, and then follow that up with an early budget.
Best guess, do you think the Bank of Canada cuts rates? I know we're still a month and a bit away from the 17th as their next policy announcement. One argument I've heard, and it kind of makes sense, is that the Bank of Canada, and the U.S. Fed to some extent, they're fighting against extraordinary circumstances lifting prices, i.e. tariffs. It's not as much about demand, which is why you want to keep interest rates high to lower demand. The demand may not exist. Inflation might just be happening because of policy. So should they be cutting interest rates as a result?
Yeah, and it's difficult. And if you look at the minutes behind the last Federal Reserve Board, the disagreement was not on the tariffs per se, but to what extent it's going to pass through an inflation. So the two that dissented and wanted the rate cut argued that it was going to be a one-time change in the price level, but not an ongoing effect. But despite the flattening of employment in the United States now with these revised numbers, we still got core inflation running 2.5% to 3% in the United States. The labor market is still relatively tight. They've still got a historically low unemployment rate. So a price level could definitely get embedded into price expectations and inflation. And of course, that's the concern of the Bank of Canada. The three core measures of inflation the Bank of Canada follows are still around 3%. Despite this weakening on the employment side. So they do have to worry about any price level shock could get embedded into wages and then get embedded into inflation. So these kind of supply shocks, which tariffs is, make it very difficult for a central bank, which, but I always come back in the case of the Bank of Canada, it is not trivial that they're pausing at 2.75 because that is the midpoint of their estimate of the neutral range. So they're not stimulating the economy, but they're not breaking the economy either. They're, figuratively, they're all just sitting there collectively with their feet up on the desk doing absolutely nothing. The Federal Reserve Board, of course, has an interest rate that's much higher than that. They're actually breaking the economy. But the the Bank of Canada, you can't say that you're holding back the economy. No, they're not. They're just acting in a neutral range. And given the uncertainty at the moment, that's probably not a bad stance. If there's clear evidence that the economy is going to deteriorate, in particular, if inflation is going to come down, then absolutely they should lower interest rates. But also keep in mind, too, and this is difficult for younger people because their entire life they've seen these super low interest rates. The 10-year bond yield in Canada is 3.4%. That's very low by almost any historical standard other than recent years. And I get it. If you're a young person, you think, hey, during my adult lifetime, they've been like below 2%. And I go, yeah, but they haven't been that in 1,000 years. And, forgive them if they're not familiar with that. It's a big shock for people who have to renew their 2021, 2022 vintage, but they're renewing it by mortgage rates that are still low on the historical standard.
Yeah. Well, one thing Trump is right about, that if in fact the Fed did cut rates, that would be good for the budget deficit. He's not wrong on that, but
I think he doesn't understand that though. If the Federal Reserve Board cut interest rates right now, longer term interest rates may go up, and almost all the U.S. debt is long term. So no, it's not clear that it would lower their borrowing costs. They don't have that much short term debt. As I referred to, our 10-year bond rate is 3.4. In a rare instance in Canadian history, the U.S. one is about a point higher than that. We usually have higher rates in the U.S. Their rates are higher than ours. And if they did something to artificially lower it, they may well push up their long-term bond yields.
And that was Don Drummond, economist, Stafford Dunning Fellow at Queen's University, and Fellow in Residence at the C.D. Howe Institute. My name is Mike Eppel, and this has been In This Economy. Thanks for listening. Appreciate it. If you have any story ideas, you can email me at mike.eppel@rci.rogers.com. On social media, I go by the handle Eppman. So it's at Eppman, Eppman. And remember, you can also listen to other Frequency Podcast Network shows, Roz and Mocha and others on the Seeker app. That's Seekr, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Again, thanks for listening. Take care.